The U.S. responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war world by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. U.S. policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. Concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including military engagements in Vietnam. The Reagan administration promoted an interventionist foreign policy that continued in later administrations, even after the end of the Cold War.
The launch of the Sputnik satellite was a complete surprise to the United States, and therefore the United States doubled down on its investment in space technology and launched its space program, which culminated in President Kennedy's call for landing a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
When Kennedy comes in, the ground is right ready for we're going to beat the Russians to the moon. The momentum is already there for science and technology, and now he just simply shapes it into taking those big rockets, making them even bigger, and going to the moon by the end of the decade, which we do.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Man on the moon. Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
There was stuff happening all around. And oh, by the way, in the late 50s, there was a little problem in Cuba with a guy named Castro, who had a little bit of support coming out of Moscow ultimately.
Fidel Castro leads a communist revolution on the island of Cuba, which is only 90 miles from the United States. He wins, establishes a new government. This is the tail end of the Eisenhower administration. President Eisenhower initiates plans for Cuban exiles to go in and take back over the government and overthrow Castro. President Kennedy gives his approval for the execution of this plan as a new president, fairly new into his administration, and it's a complete disaster. There are parameters placed on it which from the get-go do not lead to success, so no air support, other things, again, to prevent it from escalating, to bring in other world powers at the time. There are support not given to these individuals. So it ends up being a miserable failure and an embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. October of 1962, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it is discovered that the Soviet Union has placed ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba, threatening the mainland of the United States.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
And the Kennedy administration is faced with a decision on what they are going to do and how they respond to that. And what they decide, rather than launching a military attack, is they order a naval blockade and then come to an agreement, which part of is not public at the time, that the United States will withdraw missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union removing the missiles from Cuba, thus averting probably the closest that we came to publicly nuclear war in the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the ramifications of that is that it also leads Kennedy's defense secretary to believe in this idea of graduated pressure rather than direct military action. And Secretary McNamara, the defense secretary at that time, believes that if he had listened to his generals executing military attacks rather than ratcheting up gradual military pressure that led to a naval blockade, that they would have indeed executed military war. So as you're planning the involvement in the Vietnam conflict going forward, Secretary McNamara's outlook on how to apply military pressure in Vietnam is a direct result of his success, his perceived success in dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Kennedy came into office needing to establish his credentials of being able to stand up to the communists, the Soviets and the growing communist empires around the world.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
He saw in Southeast Asia the need to stand tough. Eisenhower had left office with about 800 Americans in Southeast Asia helping the South Vietnamese. Kennedy decided to escalate that by using the Special Forces, his new program that he had encouraged, and by the end of the Kennedy's administration, that 800 had grown to about 16,000. These guys were advisors. They were out with the South Vietnamese, not necessarily commanding the South Vietnamese forces, but definitely going out on patrols with them and getting themselves into firefights. When Kennedy died in 1963, Johnson took over. Johnson couldn't be seen as having lost Kennedy's legacy in Southeast Asia. Tensions ratcheted up, the situation got worse, and Johnson started pouring in conventional forces that ultimately got in the neighborhood of 500,000 Americans.
They were stymied in Washington. There was one group that says send in more troops and increase the pressure on the communists. And then the young people who were having to go, the students were beginning to create more and more demonstrations. There was more upheaval in the country regarding Vietnam.
All of this was basically a steady incremental growth that nobody really wanted, but nobody really had a better way of, what do you do about it? How do you withstand the growing tide of communist expansion? And the idea that they were afraid of was what they called the domino theory. From the standpoint of why the United States went in, there were insignificant material resources. There was nothing that we really thought we needed from an economic standpoint, but the problem was still that we had the mantle of global leadership in the struggle against communism. China was backing North Vietnam. Moscow was backing North Vietnam. We couldn't be seen as not backing South Vietnam. The United States also had the issue of credibility. If here is a nominal democracy that the United States is not willing to support against a communist threat from the North, who are the United States going to support in what part of the world?
That's why we went to Vietnam, is to help those who wanted to live in freedom as we do in this great country.
In the case of both the war in Vietnam and events that were happening back home in the United States, there was a fundamental lie at work on the part of the U.S. government regarding American involvement in Vietnam. The message that was going out to the American people, they were all based upon the idea that everything's going great, we know what we're doing, you should trust us. And as the Vietnam War dragged on, without any clear end in sight, without any obvious measures of success that the American people were recognizing, the gap between the reality that the journalists were seeing and reporting on and what was being conveyed by the television got bigger and bigger.
Walter Cronkite came over and came back to the States and made his famous broadcast on the 6 o'clock news saying, we're at a turning point.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence,
the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
Actually, Tet was a huge victory for the American military, but the news media proclaimed that it was not.
The discrepancy exploded into plain view, that everything's going great, and now all of a sudden, how is it they're able to launch countrywide attacks? And so an element of doubt and distrust started creeping in. And this doubt and distrust was mirrored in the protests of the students on college campuses against going off to a war that they increasingly didn't believe in.
I came back, we got on a plane in Vietnam, and in September of 1968, and we flew from there to Honolulu, and we stopped and refueled. They made everybody get off the plane and go in the terminal. And there were about 4 or 5 planes, so there were about 800 or 900 guys in the Honolulu airport. And while they were refueling our planes to get back into California. And there were demonstrators there. And one demonstrator came up, you could hear him yelling and screaming over in the corner and spit on one of our guys.
This tension builds and builds, and now it leads to President Johnson ultimately deciding in '68 that he is not going to run for re-election. That is earth-shattering.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Nixon has a plan. He's got a new idea that's going to lead to success in Vietnam. He comes in and he knows that he's got to get the United States out of Vietnam, not so much because he wants to see us lose in Vietnam, as because in his mind it's a sideshow. The big picture is that struggle with the Soviet Union, the big global issues. And we've been wrapped up in Vietnam all during the 1960s. While we've been tied up in Vietnam, the Soviets are advancing all across Africa. They're making gains in South Asia. And all of these things are distracting America from the big picture, which is its global responsibilities. So Nixon needs to pull us out of Indochina. You can't be seen as losing it, but you got to get us out. One way we're going to do that is start playing the China card. He can start getting Chinese to help influence Chinese presence, Chinese activity to be an American friend, and maybe start balancing off some of the Soviet threat there. Nixon can do that because he's got very solid anti-communist credentials. And so for him to be able to make a outreach effort to the Chinese to try to get China to join the world, to come out of its little shell, he can do that where a Democrat cannot, because a Democrat would be seen as being weak on communism. Nixon is hard on communism. He's proven that by being Eisenhower's vice president, by having been an anti-communist all during the 50s and 60s. And so when he makes the effort to reach out to communist China, that's okay, because he doesn't have to prove to anybody in the U.S. that he's a good, solid American who's anti-communist. So Nixon has started his national security advisor and then his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, working in secret trying to negotiate a peace with the North Vietnamese, some way to get the United States out of Southeast Asia. In 1973, they achieved such an accord, and that Paris Peace Accords result in the United States leaving Southeast Asia. But then Nixon has this little problem called Watergate. Ultimately, Nixon has to give up the presidency because he's committed some crimes, and those have been discovered by the various congressional committees investigating it. Sam Ervin from North Carolina helping to lead those, Senate Judiciary Committee. Nixon resigns. The new vice president, Gerald Ford, comes in. He's kind of a caretaker. Jimmy Carter comes in. But the American focus had largely changed. There were other things to worry about.
In the wake of Watergate and the Vietnam War, America faced formidable challenges. With disillusionment and distrust of the government, a major energy crisis, unemployment, and economic stagflation, the Cold War at this time was of little concern to most Americans.
In the 1980s, when President Reagan came in and started talking, shall we say, talking tough to Moscow, he makes two important speeches. In one of them, he refers to the Soviet Union as what's called the evil empire speech.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
He's making a reference to the values of the West and how these are worth defending, and how what the Soviet Union is standing for is the exact opposite and should be resisted and fought against. Puts the Soviets on very public notice that the United States is against you and we are going to resist you. Reagan announces SDI, Star Wars, which is the idea that the United States is going to develop devices, technical means, whereby it can produce a shield of some sorts. It may not be able to stop all of your missiles getting through, but it will stop a fair number of them.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
The Soviets don't like this. They know that they are technologically incapable of matching any American effort like this, but they also see that it's going to cost a ton of money, which they don't have. There is a tremendous degree of fear here. And then at that standpoint, people started thinking, oh my gosh, this is a nuclear danger again. And they saw it as President Reagan being the one who was causing all the problems by talking tough.
For 20 years, the Soviet Union has been accumulating enormous military might. They didn't stop when their forces exceeded all requirements of a legitimate defensive capability, and they haven't stopped now. During the past decade and a half, the Soviets have built up a massive arsenal of new strategic nuclear weapons, weapons that can strike directly at the United States.
So all this is leading to a period of tremendous tension between the two powers. All during the 1980s, there is this degree of feeling of freedom is on the march, if you will. The idea of democracy, of one man, one vote, values that the West is in favor of. And that's starting to get picked up on by the people in the East. Now, in the early stages of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall went up. Berlin being a city under military occupation from World War II, 1945, there was a western section and there was an eastern sector. And if you could get to Berlin, you could walk across the dividing line totally unguarded. You're now in West Berlin, and from there you can now catch a trip back to West Germany and be free. The communist East Germans were hemorrhaging their young people, and they knew that if they were going to be able to survive as a country, they had to keep these young folks, the young, the educated, the productive, future productive members of society around. In 1961, they suddenly put up a wall. So by the 80s, these people have been trapped, if you will, in the Eastern Bloc for a generation. They want freedom. They haven't got it. They've been kept in at gunpoint. In the latter stages of the 80s, 87, Reagan goes to Berlin. And he stands in front of the Berlin Wall and he makes a famous speech.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Well, that's heady stuff. Now, Gorbachev has come in as the new head of the Soviet Union in March '85. And he realizes that the Soviet Union is basically failing. It is coming apart at the seams. Its economy is a basket case. It militarily cannot keep up with the United States. Its people want to leave. Culturally, it's all in a wreck. And he has to make changes. And he puts out this idea called perestroika, restructuring. He doesn't want to get rid of the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to get rid of the communist control of the government, but he wants to reorder it, make it better. The problem is, once he unleashes those little locks on freedom that are keeping the people down, they want more, and they want more, and it gets more and more going, and success builds on success, as it were, so that by the late 80s, this stuff is getting really on the verge of being out of control. The East Germans get rid of their border controls with the Hungarians, and people now start leaving East Germany, passing through Hungary to make it to the West. And ultimately, at the same time all that is happening in '89, spring of '89, stuff is now heating up in China, because the young people in China, the young university students, are catching that same contagion that their comrades in Eastern Europe had. It's called freedom. And they want to be able to think for themselves, and they want to be able to have all those benefits, those things that we take for granted. That ultimately culminates in June '89 in the Tiananmen Square. And that's where you've got maybe 100,000 young people out there protesting, wanting freedom. Now, they're not calling for the overthrow of the Communist Party. They're just simply wanting to have greater openness. They want to have what we would call free elections. The communists are not having any of that. And ultimately, in early June of '89, they send in the tanks, which is where you see this at. While all that's happening, the tensions are still building up in East Germany. And ultimately, in November of '89, the wall starts coming down. But with that, the communist monopoly on power is broken. And very soon thereafter, East Germany collapses and is absorbed by West Germany. And by about 2 years after that, the Soviet Union is disintegrated. The Cold War ended, but it's not really gone away.